welcome back. For our next session, delighted to introduce Lisa Friedman from the New York Times to moderate this session on the design imperative. Lisa, welcome to the stage.
Hi. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. This is wonderful. I am Lisa Friedman from the New York Times, and I am very honored to have a terrific panel with us here this afternoon. We have, to my immediate right, Manish Bapna, President and CEO of NRDC, not NDRC. To his right, we have Finn Harris, the co-founder of Earthrise Studio, and joined by video, we have Radhika Khosla, Research Director for the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development, and Sheila Patel, Founder and Director for Spark. Well, we're here today to talk about the design imperative. This may feel a little hackneyed. Some of you have heard this before, but 10 years ago when I first started covering climate change, it really was about saving the polar bears. And addressing climate change now, we all know, is very much about this remarkable shift to understanding that this is fundamentally about people. It's about where we live. It's about how we live, how we build. All of these issues have become a really critical piece of this. Manish and I were talking backstage. In some parts of the world, in California, for example, homeowners are struggling to get insurance, wildfire insurance for their homes because of the intensity and frequency of climate-driven wildfires. In other parts of the world, rising seas and flooding are literally washing away homes. We'll talk about those issues as well as the construction industry itself, which accounts for about 40% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Maybe perhaps I'd love, Manish, if you could set the stage for us and explain why climate change and where and how we live matters.
Absolutely, Lisa. This is such a critical topic. I mean, homes, buildings, cities are at the absolute front lines of climate change, right? We live in an urban world. More than half of the population on this planet live in cities, and that number is increasing rapidly, most noticeably in Asia and in Africa. And this is where we're beginning to see the impacts of climate strike particularly hard, whether it's around heat, whether it's around flooding, whether it's around droughts, really seeing how cities, how they're built, how homes are built, very, very much on the front lines. But it's not only a story of how we tackle resilience in cities, it's also recognizing that homes, how we construct our homes, how we build buildings, how we lay out cities, have incredible implications also on greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to think about, when we look at a city, the buildings, how they're constructed. We need to think about the layout of a city, what the implications of the layout of the city are in terms of transportation, public transit versus private car ownership. We need to think about power and whether or not how easy it is to actually generate renewable rooftop solar on apartment buildings versus single-family dwellings. Need to think about nature and the role nature plays in cities. I just want to kind of give three kind of cross-cutting themes as we think about buildings and cities and climate that'll be useful for us to keep an eye out for. One is when we construct a building or lay out a city, that stays with us for decades. There's an incredible lock-in effect. So getting the design right at the outset is incredibly important, particularly in those cities, in those countries that still are rapidly urbanizing. In the developed world, where cities are already laid out, we need to think about how to kind of move towards retrofitting buildings and cities in a cost-effective way so that they are indeed more clean, more resilient. The second theme, just to put on the table, is when we think about cities, we think oftentimes about concrete structures. Nature has a critical role to play in how we think about building resilience and even reducing emissions. In Chicago, green roofs A big program they've put in place quite recently has reduced stormwater runoff by 36%. We see examples in China of sponge cities where they create more permeable surfaces to absorb water during monsoons so that the damage from that flood is diminished over time. We see in New York City an effort to protect upstream catchment areas, the Catskills, to enable clean water to flow to the city, which is a much more economical kind of approach than actually a concrete water filtration plant. So the second point, nature is critical. The third and last point is that oftentimes it is low-income residents, the poor, those that live in informal settlements that suffer the most when it comes to climate impacts. And how we think about responding to their needs, how we think about giving them agency over what they need to do, how we channel financing to them is critically important. So this is as much a conversation about equity as it is about climate, and our narrative and our approach needs to recognize that the two are still inextricably connected in cities.
That's great. Thank you for setting the table. Radhika, if I could turn to you for a moment, can you tell me, do you feel like policymakers at this stage have a strategic understanding of the intersection between climate and development priorities?
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Manish, for setting that stage with themes that are very similar to the ones that that we all have in mind. Now, the reason why the built environment is so important is because it is one of those areas where you can align climate and development priorities, but particularly if you focus on that design imperative up front, right? Like Manish said, there's a certain lock-in that is built into buildings and infrastructure, and that lock-in is not just a lock-in of technology, it's also a lock-in of institutions and of policies, and it's a lock-in of behaviors. Because once the built environment is shaped, the solution space within it is also set. Now, policymakers traditionally understand this, but there has been a systematic lack of capacity within policy making, particularly in developing countries. But sort of the story of building energy codes in most places has been one of slow progress, and that sort of lack of capacity within policy making for the built environment, whether it is capacity of people, capacity of expertise, and also financing, has been an issue. And we've ended up in the situation then where we are today, where in 2020, buildings were responsible for 50% of global electricity demand. That's half of global electricity was being consumed in buildings. And we have a long way to go before we actually reach a level where we can be on a path that is low carbon, that is aligning development and climate change, that can be close to net zero if that's what we're aspiring for.
And just to clarify, but you think most of the barriers in developing countries are capacity? It's a capacity issue?
Well, I think in developing countries, we have multiple priorities, right? I mean, that's the starting point. Climate change is but one of multiple objectives that countries are facing. And those multiple objectives often are much more pressing, whether it is shelter, whether it's housing, whether it's crime, clean air, clean water, jobs. And then climate change comes, it's on the table, but it may not be the driving force behind policy. In fact, development is the driving force behind policy. And that leads to sort of, different choices that are often made about the built environment.
Finn, let me turn to you. You work on something called regenerative design. Tell us what that is. Explain it.
Yeah, so a way to frame this. So I'm currently an architecture student. I'm writing my research thesis at Cambridge University, and one of the things that seems prevalent to me in this conversation is it's really important to acknowledge that we don't live in the environment that we used to live in. And what I mean by that is over the last 10,000 years, we've inhabited this period of relative stability where the temperature is increased or decreased by about 1%. As we know, we now live firmly outside of that safe zone. And so the dwellings that we have today are no longer sufficient for the climatic conditions that we are experiencing and will continue to experience. So I've been looking into frameworks that can increase community resilience, and one of them is regenerative design. And this is a approach to design that really is rooted in indigenous cultures. You can see its developments in contemporary culture in the sort of 80s and 90s, but it's really about creating a whole systems approach to living in symbiosis with natural systems. And that's contrary to what we've traditionally done over the last couple of hundred years, which is to live in sort of opposition with natural systems. The goal is to sort of somewhat control them or even dominate them. That's no longer a sustainable relationship with nature. And so as we go into a period of increasing instability, we need to find ways of working with nature and harnessing the natural regenerative capacities of nature itself.
So what does that look like in a housing development or apartment unit?
Right, so the research I'm doing looks at a couple of key different categories, so shelter, food, water, energy, and waste. And so you can look at all 5 of those and ask the simple question is, how do we close the loop? How do we make sure the nutrients we are taking out or the materials we're using, say for construction, can at some point go back into the natural cycle? And that applies across the board in those different categories.
And Sheila, thank you so much for joining us as well. I wanted to first turn to you about how we design. I read that you've said that the design of our cities are over-influenced by European design and planning standards. Tell us a little bit about what you mean by that and how you see the problem from your organization.
Thank you for putting me on my soapbox. Most of the, so let me start off by saying that for the last 250 years, both the North and subsequently the South have been in pursuit of modernization. That modernization has emerged out of the whole Industrial Revolution and an aspiration to do bigger things, to compete. And the process itself, which was in the North, became in some way, I think, perverted, because when it came to the global South, city development was exclusionary, it was meant for the elite, it was meant for people who were part of the colonial project, and everybody who served them was excluded from this process and therefore lived in a very different marginal world, which I call the shadow of the modern city. That has worked for our elite after independence too, as a result of which these land ownership or land lease systems, standards of design, standards of what is minimum entitlement, everything that all of, both young architect and designer and Radhika, you talked about formal housing, formal use of electricity. There is no significant acknowledgement to the fact that in the last 50 years, the maximum urbanization has happened in the informal part of the cities, that the entire city's circulation, as you would call it, depends on these people, yet they don't benefit at all from it. They imitate to the extent that they can the materials. And I've used this backdrop to show you a sea of roofs made of asbestos and zinc. That's the roofing material. And therefore, we have started this campaign called A Roof Over Our Heads, saying, how is technology, how is social justice, how is dignity, how are the design imperatives going to impact this bottom 50% of people who live in cities on an average? And how are we going to acknowledge that all formal financial investments, all the material design and research that is done does not in any way come here.
Yeah.
Colleges and universities do not teach this to the extent of the volume of the problem. So this is totally exclusionary and therefore will not in any way help us produce a just transition in the built environment. And the worst victim of all this is the absence of universal design systems that work for everyone.
Thank you, Sheila. And I want, I think our next round of conversation needs to be about who makes decisions and how. But before we get to that, I wanted to pick up on your point about modernization. And Radhika, I know that you did a really fascinating piece recently, study on air conditioning and cooling, the future of air conditioning and cooling in India, and the needs that we're going to see growing. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that how communities deal with heat is going to be really central to the next decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And to Sheila's point, air conditioning and cooling is a prime example of how certain ideas of modernity, of progress, developed actually very specifically in the US in the 60s, have now become the norm around the world. Cultures that have dealt with extreme heat for decades and centuries and have had local, vernacular, passive cooling ways are now abandoning those. And even in informal settlements, in the work that we've done, we see that when there is an opportunity to be able to get an air conditioner, people get in an air conditioner, right? And so cooling is actually one of those places that is going to be, in many ways, the downfall of the built environment's future electricity consumption, because it's a trajectory that's not yet locked into. The IEA statistic is that an equivalent of new air conditioners every second will be bought for the next 30 years globally. So that's 10 new air conditioners every second for the next 30 years. But the studies also tell us that in spite of that growth, 2 to 4 billion people will not have access to air conditioning. Right? So you have this dichotomy where this idea of progress, modernity, that has actually really infiltrated the building design community, because there was, sort of in the 60s and 70s, there was this idea that all homes could look identical. You didn't have to do the creative work of thinking about what local climates are. All buildings could look similar, and then they just have been replicated. And now we're at a stage actually where we've lost a lot of that individual local knowledge that has sat within countries for a long time. And there is still a moment. I mean, I think cooling does offer an acute moment of opportunity, but it's a closing window of opportunity at the same time, where we could really mainstream passive cooling solutions through ventilation,
Can you
through
tell
green
the audience what passive cooling is? Sure.
Sure. Apologies for that. But passive cooling are forms of cooling that do not use a mechanical energy intensive cooling. So basically not using the air conditioner, but using ventilation, using building materials, using insulation, shading, glazing, forms of cooling that do not require energy guzzling technologies.
And maybe I don't know if you or perhaps Manish can speak to this. Obviously, countries some years ago signed the Kigali Amendment to draw down HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which I'm very proud of being able to pronounce, a potent greenhouse gas that is emitted from refrigerants. Do you foresee the demand for cooling sort of canceling out the gains made by, these pledges from countries to draw down HFCs? I don't know if that's.
Who's that for? Is it from Manish or is it from me?
Pardon me, Radhika, if that's something that you can speak to.
Yeah, sure. And then Manish, feel free to add on. But yeah, Lisa, I mean, the thing is that the projections account for the Montreal Protocol, for the Kigali Amendment, and they help, but the growth in cooling far sort of outpaces the sort of results we would see. I'm sure we need better HFCs or sort of getting rid of HFCs altogether, and better refrigerants, alternative refrigerants. But there's a lot more that cooling can do that goes beyond the refrigerants, right? And even energy efficiency, it assumes the use of energy of very high magnitudes. The best technology available today, which came out of the global cooling prize, which sort of happened last year, is still a vapor compression based air conditioner. We've been using that for decades now. We haven't reached a point where we have technology readiness levels for any alternative form of cooling that is not so detrimental to the environment. Efficiency and refrigerants don't account for those other passive solutions that I was talking about.
Manish, who's doing it right? What countries, communities, cities out there are thinking about this in the right way and developing policies that address both development and climate change?
So I think there are. So I'm going to one point I wanted to add and build on what Sheila was saying, and then using that as perhaps a way to answer that question. And I think Sheila's point that where a lot of the urbanization is happening in the developing world in informal settlements and the lack of agency or voice or power that these groups have is actually also seen in the developed world. I was struck, even in the United States, if you look back at the 1920s and 1930s, very racist housing policies in cities actually drew red lines around districts in cities which were considered to be too poor, quite frankly, too black to invest in. Little plug, the New York Times did a very nice piece on this. And in those areas, you saw a lack of public support for infrastructures such as parks, green spaces, or even those are areas where water was oftentimes provided through lead pipes rather than renovated. And you see this very strong overlay, even in the United States, of poverty, race, and a lack of actual effort being done to try to tackle some of these issues in a much, much more serious way. So just to underscore that this issue of the asymmetry in power dynamics, or the power kind of asymmetry, really plays out and persists to this day. So when you ask who is doing this right, I think we need to be also asking, it's not just a technological solution, it's also a political or political economy solution of who is doing this right. And it's further exacerbated in the developing world because we did this a couple of years ago. There was a very good analysis done around municipal per capita budgets. How much money do cities have per person to invest in public infrastructure? And if you look at rich cities like New York or Singapore or cities in the developed world, somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 US per year per person. If you look at the developing world, Accra or Colombo or probably even small cities in India, it's oftentimes a couple $100.
Wow.
So when you think about solutions for the developing world, you can't just replicate what developed world cities can do. And so the need for national and international sources of finance becomes incredibly important. There are small examples of cities doing some of this well. I do think that there is, I think Bangladesh actually is a very good example, in no small part, of really recognizing the need to channel flexible funding to local communities, to local cities, to invest and build resilience. Bangladesh is on the front lines of climate impacts. It doesn't have a very strong public system in place, and so they've relied on local communities, local organizations to help build that resilience. And to some extent, I think Bangladesh has a lot to teach the rest of the world about how to build resilience. So that would be one example in a developing country context that I think is moving in the right direction.
That's great. Sheila, can you tell us a little bit, tell us a little bit about what local communities that you're working with are doing and how we empower local communities to be in the driver's seat of these decisions that we're talking about?
Well, I think that one of the first real major challenges that people living informally have is identity. We live in a world of documentation. And people who move from one state to the other, for instance, in India, if they have documentation of another states, they don't get entitlement in the other states. So in the last COVID crisis, if you had an ID card that was from Bihar and you were in Maharashtra, you did not get food until there was a hue and cry and a big noise, and then some relief came.
Wow.
The same thing's happening, for instance, with a lot of climate migrants. So I think one of the first things that all of us do, and we are able to only do it because we are large social movements. We have a global identity. People learn from one place and move it to the other, and therefore we develop a sense of identity. We begin to hold our mayors, our elected representatives accountable to work with us than rather throw things at us. We need to do a lot of information and data gathering in a way not different from what Radhika is doing in the formal world, to actually talk about the development deficits. You know, when you talk about infrastructure deficits, what we found out in the climate, in the COVID space was WHO didn't have SOPs for dense settlements like slums. The cities didn't have infrastructure of health facilities to address the challenges that poor people faced. None of our cities have transport that works for poor people. And so the list goes on, and it is sad and disappointing that every neighborhood, every city, every network has to produce this data as evidence time and again to demand accountability, most of which is pushed back because of what Manish said, which is that we don't have the money. But they have the money to build the flyovers, they have the money to build tall buildings through all the international finance that they get, but they don't have money to provide infrastructure or basic amenities or transport to the poor. And therefore the divide gets more. So our role is to produce strong voices that are persistent. Sometimes it takes us 5 to 8 years to get minimum water and sanitation. And for me, this is the worst catastrophe in today's world, that this should be something that should be universally done. It doesn't require local groups to go lobby their people to do it. But that's what we've been doing for the last 20 years. And then we help our municipalities to be accountable to us. But it's a very slow process. So what we're saying as social movements, if it takes us that long, and we are not even 0.1% of the urban population, how long is it going to take for the redesigning of the development control rules, the norms and standards, universal provision of all these things? It's going to take 2 centuries.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen in the next 25, 30 years if this space is left. So we're not in a very happy space. We're in a screaming and a shouting space, but we are not in a space where we feel something good is happening.
That is powerful. Finn, are there ways that, new theories of design and architecture and regenerative design that you're working on in the UK address environmental justice and climate justice in your communities?
Yeah, there are, but I think this is really the major challenge. So for architects, we often imagine new ways of living, of building, of constructing, but when we talk about the climate crisis, we're talking about an emergency that is very much here today. And the majority of buildings that will exist, so let's take the UK, for example, in 2050, where we know we need to be net carbon zero, or have already been built. So it's not really about the design of new buildings and infrastructure as much as it is the retrofit and adaptation of existing buildings today. And just to paint a quick picture of that, in the UK we have roughly 30 million buildings. 85% of them are powered by natural gas. And that contributes to about a quarter of the UK's carbon emissions. So really that's where the focus should be, is adapting buildings that exist today. And we haven't yet built a framework that that offers the resources to do that at scale. So we need to see a lot more money, and more importantly, we need to see empowering local communities to start playing a critical role in that adaptation. And that means increasing the insulation of homes. It means swapping natural gas boilers for heat pump systems, swapping cooking appliances. So it's a huge, almost a sort of wartime effort transition we need to see. It works out to adapting about 1 million homes a year between now and 2050. So that's really significant, and I think that's where the focus should be, and we're not really having that conversation at the moment.
You know, I don't want to leave this conversation about local involvement if there are, let me open it up to the panelists. Are there other thoughts that any of you wanted to add about how local communities can be in the driver's seat in these decisions? Okay, Sheila.
Let's talk very, very quickly and for a short time.
Thanks.
You know, today, the survival strategies of all people living informally are based on the weighing of their knowledge about their local traditional way of living and what they see happening in cities. And most of them are producing their homes out of recycled material from formal industry. What we're saying to people who are the big businesses who are in the construction business is to say, your new social responsibility is to produce housing material
What a good transition. Yes, go ahead,
that
please,
is
sorry.
for people. You have to, we are telling designers, we are telling architects, we're telling planners, don't do things just because you were taught this in your university education in the US or the UK or in Europe. Develop this process on the base of the reality in your own cities. Produce norms and standards that work for people. So if you do things with people, the chances of producing those 1 million houses will be more probable than if these were done in your studios and then you just told the businesses to do that.
Yep.
The consumer and the person who lives there must want to do that. And for me, that is local adaptation. And that is the production of resilience.
So that's perfect. Let's turn to industry and what industry needs to do to change and whether it's doing it and why it's not. Manish, can we start with you? I mean, what are some of the big changes that need to be seen? And I don't know if we need to divide this into both the developed and the developing world. We can choose where to start. Maybe we can start in the US and Europe and then move on.
Sure. So when we think a little bit, I mean, just to get a little bit more concrete around what are the types of solutions we need to see in the developed world, you know, 4 or 5 things come to mind. The first, we need to see real radical improvements in the efficiency, energy efficiency of insulation, of appliances, of a variety of things that just reduce costs. We need to see the electrification of a variety of things. I mean, just as Finn was mentioning around natural gas, how do we think about the electrification of heating and cooking and cooling? That's going to be a very important part of the conversation. We need to think about how we actually put in place renewables in oftentimes multifamily affordable housing units. We've talked about how to think about solar in the context of single-family homes. How does one think about renewables in the context of multifamily dwellings? We need to think about, we talk a lot about electric vehicles, but again, typically someone has a garage, they have their own charging station, their own parking space, and they can afford an EV. What does public transit or what does electric vehicles look like in cities, particularly for low-income residents? So thinking about car sharing, thinking about public charging stations, and we need to think about nature. So this, just to give some sense of the types of solutions. So as we think a little bit about what needs to change, part of it is around policies and codes that create incentives. Part of it is around providing money to actually address the higher upfront costs oftentimes associated with these transitions. And that is why, at least in the United States, there's a lot of emphasis and hope for some of the money that's contained in the Build Back Better Act, which has not yet been enacted, but if it is enacted, would give a lot of that initial support to be able to jumpstart the transition that needs to happen. Most of these investments, if not all these investments, are economically very, very positive, very viable. The challenge are the upfront costs. And so getting that financing in place to address the upfront costs becomes a very important part of the process. But the last point I would make is in terms of how we actually move, comes back to a point Sheila and Radhika have both made, which is around the importance of also empowering and giving agency to local communities to get a little bit more funding and flexibility around what types of investments get done, how and where. So those are just some of the more concrete solutions and some of the shifts that need to take place to get industry to respond in a more serious way.
And Finn, I think I mentioned this statistic before, but that the construction industry itself accounts for about 40% of the world's global greenhouse gas emissions. How do you get companies to think about the materials that they're using?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the carbon impact of the building industry, we can divide it into two areas. We have embodied carbon, which is the carbon that's created through the material process, and then operational carbon, which is sort of what I was talking about before, which is the carbon produced through the lifetime of a building. The operational carbon is the larger issue here, but we should also be talking about embodied carbon, and so the elephants in the room here are steel and concrete. These are two materials that underpin contemporary design and construction, and they're fundamentally not sustainable in the current crisis we face. That poses a massive challenge because they're cheap and they're fast materials. They're the basis of our sort of industrial, contemporary, modern approach to architecture. But we need to be looking much more at fibrous materials like timber and bamboo and hemp and hay. These are materials that lock in carbon, that are organic, so they can go back into the cycle once they've finished their lifespan. And this is quite a radical shift away from the way we build today. But these materials offer, for me as a young architectural designer in training, a lot of optimism for what a different approach to design might look like. And so we need a lot more innovation and investment into how these materials can be used in modern construction.
Thank you. And I'm just going to pause one moment to say that in a few minutes I'll be opening this up to questions, so I encourage those of you in the audience to think of questions, and please, if you're online, send in your questions as well. Radhika, can you speak to what it takes to influence industry in developing countries to fundamentally change the way they think about development and building?
Yeah. So Lisa, what has worked well in terms of policies is when building codes are mandatory and when minimum energy performance standards are mandatory. When these lie in the voluntary domain, their implementation is extremely low and weak, and all of that comes down to the lack of capacity, the lack of financing, the huge burden of multiple responsibilities that policymakers have, where sort of coordinating with different departments, which the built environment requires, because it's you're dealing with questions of energy, you're dealing with questions of urban development and area, and that kind of work, when it is voluntary, is not something that realistic developers, architects or engineers, or the end users, in some sense the consumers, are after. And so mandatory policies is what we have seen consistently works better, and that is, and in terms of what Finn is saying about operational energy, I think is both direct and indirect emissions. So direct emissions at the site of the building, but also indirect emissions, which is electrification, as Manish talked about, but decarbonization of that electrification. If that electricity supply is being fueled by fossil fuels, in the end, we're sort of in the same place where, the site of pollution is just moved elsewhere. So I will say that, unless we have stringent standards and the ability to be able to mandate these policies, that at least for the formal sector, which is, remember, where most of the energy guzzling is taking place, the informal sector is not really responsible for that large amount of energy and carbon emissions. But of course, the accounting for that is an open question.
Let me turn to our audience. I have a little bit of a glare here. So if you have a question, raise your hand and there are microphones going around in the front on my left. coming. If you could please tell us your name and organization as well.
Thanks. My name is Darian Crimmin, a clean energy and affordable housing developer from Boston, Massachusetts. And the company I work for manages over 100,000 apartments across the country. We're actually the largest affordable housing manager in the United States. And so I'm so glad you're talking about existing buildings, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where we live. That's where, you know, millions of people live, and we use a lot of energy in those apartments, in those homes. And you mentioned financing, and financing, we definitely need more of it, but there's, I think, a misconception that this is all going to pay for itself. And so from a private real estate perspective, to save 50% off our energy bill, to save 50% of our carbon emissions, it's going to cost $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 per apartment, and it's going to save maybe $1,000 a year, maybe $1,500 a year.
And the question?
What is the roadmap? What is the actual solution that the private sector needs to move ahead with retrofitting existing buildings?
Maybe, Manish, I can start with you, or whoever wants to take Finn. Where do you want to? Oh, you were nodding at me.
I mean, yeah, you start and I'll jump in after.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think that depending on the types of investments we're talking about, you are right that the upfront costs are non-trivial. Part of it has to do with how we actually ramp up more innovation to reduce the technological cost for some of these solutions. We have seen over the past 10 or 15 years quite a dramatic decline in a lot of different types of clean energy investments. We need to continue to see that play out a little bit further, faster. Second is that there's oftentimes a fairly significant difference between the economic cost-benefit analysis and the financial cost-benefit analysis. So the public health improvements oftentimes associated with cleaner energy or cleaner air are non-trivial. And so there's a strong argument to be made for subsidies that can actually help address the disconnect between the economic benefits and the financial benefits in the short term. The third is just how we actually bring down the cost of capital for some of these financing arrangements in ways that better reflect the risk associated with these types of investments, which are still perceived to be fairly high risk. This is a path forward, and we need to get there. So it's not that we're not going to get there. The question is how fast we can get down that path.
Anyone want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to speak quickly to that. I mean, you're absolutely right. If the cost falls onto the private sector, or even worse, onto the individual homeowner, we're not going to see the transition that's required. And so to give an example, the UK announced last month a scheme, a £450 million scheme to help homeowners transition to heat pumps to power their homes. It costs about, roughly, on average, £10,000 per home to put in a heat pump. And the scheme offered a £5,000 grant for each individual. So this is still a cost that's prohibitively high for most people. And so we need to be putting much larger investment in grants and subsidies to help people make that transition. But as you mentioned as well, we need to be investing in the technology to be able to reduce the cost of installing systems like heat pump technology.
Radhika, Sheila?
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
Okay, I'll just be very quick, which is to say, in addition to what Manish and Finn said, is the delivery of services that are combined. So, for instance, district heating, district cooling, those are often ways in which costs come down. Because remember, like, what do we need these technologies for, right? The question we always have to ask about supply is, what do we need that supply for? And if that service can be provided to individuals and households, often at costs that are lower, because then every household is not putting it at, a heat pump or an air conditioner, but actually it's been done at a district level, which has higher efficiency and often lower cost. That's another model by which we can get there faster, but we have a long way to go.
Let's try and take two at a time if we could. We have a question all the way in the back and then a question in the second row.
My name is Lindsay Question, and I'm with the Karuna Foundation. And my question builds off of, Radhika, your last comments before the questions. You mentioned that in many places, green building policies, energy efficiency policies are not followed due to capacity, financing, all sorts of things. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your thoughts on what it would take to be able to enforce those policies or write policies that are more appropriate for the areas in which we're struggling to meet them. Thank you.
Thank you. And in the second row here? Yes, thanks.
Hello? Okay. It's kind of building off the topic of policy. But
Sorry, your name and organization?
Oh, hi. Valentin from Polluters Out. I'm an architect and also teach sustainable systems at Parsons. So Barnabas Calder put out a book earlier this year called Architecture from Prehistory to Climate Emergency, which looks at the history of architecture through the lens of energy as the kind of most valuable currency that we've had as humans. So he says that we shouldn't be building any new buildings at all in developed areas, especially the UK and parts of the US. So if you wanted to build a new building, you should have to provide a valid reason as to why you were doing that. And so everything should be retrofit. So my question is, are there policies that you have seen that have come through that are innovative in that way in any geographic region?
Thank you. So the first question for Radhika, what will it take to get the capacity, get the finance, and put in place these policies that you're talking about?
Yeah, thanks. The question is, how do we move to to having there be outcomes of success if we measure them in that way? And like I've said before, it's sort of getting mandatory policies, so not having them be voluntary. And what is the purpose of mandatory policies? Is accountability in the system, right? Having accountability in the system where different levels of government are responsible to each other, where the urban municipal government is responsible in some sense, say, to the state government if it doesn't implement building energy codes, and the state government is responsible to the central government. All of these policies exist, but there isn't penalty or accountability built in. So that's one. And like I've said before, capacity of people and capacity financially is really key. The budgets allocated right now, both in terms of people budget and financial budget, is enormously low. You often have 1 to 2 people within a state government responsible for managing energy in the built environment for the whole state. And that is just not commensurate to the growth that we have. So capacity, finances, and accountability is what I think it would take.
Thank you. And
could I just
yes,
add one small point to that? One of the things that we did is kind of a study over a couple of years on adaptation and how to build resilience. And one of the things that we noted as part of that research is how modest the investments are made in terms of people that actually are responsible for updating building codes or energy codes more broadly, particularly in the developing world. And that this happens not very often, and when it does happen, it happens very piecemeal. And one of the biggest return on investments we could make is for the international community to help actually build capacity, help support trained experts in countries around the world to think about how to update codes more comprehensively, more regularly, in a world where the changing climate requires us to do so. The relative investment to do that from human capital would be fairly modest. The impacts that would have would be dramatic. There's just small little things like that that could really unlock much greater ambition on these types of issues.
And I saw some more hands in the room, so I just very quickly want to get to our second question. Did you have thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great point. We need to be much more creative with the way we're using the building stock, particularly in developed countries, and the UK is a great example. As I said, we have 30 million buildings existing, and the majority of them need to be adapted. So that's not just to make them more energy efficient, but adaptive reuse is a whole other field of study and design, where we think about how buildings could be used for multiple purposes. We've seen that come out in COVID, where our homes have also become our offices, and I think that's a really significant opportunity now to reimagine how structures support our lives and sort of adapt them for multiple use, and therefore avoid the necessity to build infrastructure in the future. I was just going to speak as well to that second point. We also need more public pressure to encourage governments to put up the money that's required for these sort of adaptation. And there's a great example in the campaign Insulate Britain. Maybe some people are aware of it. They're following the tactics of Extinction Rebellion. There's a group of people who are lying down in the road to protest the lack of support from government in adapting the British housing stock. I think we if we have the privilege to be able to get out there and campaign and protest, we should be using it and really adding pressure onto our political bodies.
Unfortunately, we now have just a little under 30 seconds left on our panel, so I'm going to ask each of you very briefly in 10 seconds, what is the most important thing that can come out of this Glasgow COP26 to address development, building, and climate change? Sheila?
I have no expectations because just like in this particular webinar, the discussion always ends up with a lot of very good conversations about the built environment in the formal cities, but not about the bottom 40%. And it reflects in every way the politics of the world today, which is going to even expand exponentially this divide. So the chances that global events like the COP will bring any change to the lives of the poor, for me, is quite dismal, I'm sorry to say. I have no great hopes or any expectations. I'm very sorry to say that.
Radhika, are you equally skeptical of COP26 delivering in this way?
I'm not hugely optimistic, only because I think announcements of targets is fine, but what would be useful, successful is implementation of them, and implementation in the short term, not in the long term. So unless we work out a way to ensure that, at some point it's sort of empty promises.
Finn, thoughts from you on what
I
could
share
possibly...
some of Sheila's concerns or pessimism there. I mean, I think the key thing that I would ideally love to see happen is a much larger sum of money put in from developed countries, those who have been historically responsible for creating the climate crisis, to support frontline communities, countries that have had a very minimal impact on changing the climate in adapting and building resilience. But that was promised in Copenhagen, it was renewed in Paris at the COP there, and we have consistently seen countries fail to pay their fair share. But I think we need to keep up the pressure that those payments are made.
Manish, is anything going to surprise us in a positive way this next week?
After those three. So
it's up to you to leave this on a note of optimism.
I'm going to say, and Sheila and I have had for years this back and forth on this question. We have seen over the past 5-10 years, whether they're worth it or not, there's been an increasing ambition in terms of commitments being made. So the real question now is whether or not those commitments can be leveraged in terms of really creating change on the ground. So the real operative word at this COP is moving from commitments to action, and at the end of the day, it's about accountability. So now we have countries saying the right things. We have companies saying the right things. They've said it repeatedly. They've said it in the past. They haven't necessarily held true to it. But now they've said it again and again, and I think as we move away from this COP, the shift to accountability is going to be the test about whether or not this COP indeed did take a step forward. And in that, I think, very much recognize what Radhika, Sheila, Finn are all saying, but we got to keep on fighting.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you for being here, and a warm round of applause for our panelists, Manish, Finn, Sheila, Radhika. Thank you for joining us.